We'll look at ARIA in a bit of detail today, and hopefully that'll clear up some of the questions that you might have around it. I know when I first started looking at ARIA, it looked crazy. So trying to figure it out was a little bit difficult, but hopefully some of them questions will get answered. So the first question is, I guess, is what is ARIA? So the Y part actually stands for the Web Accessibility Initiative. They are part of the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, who develop standards and support materials for accessibility. So you might have heard of W3C before. They created the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are the accessibility standards that we work to. And the Web Accessibility Initiative is part of that. ARIA itself actually stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which is a bit of a mouthful and sounds a bit fluffy, but when we're talking about ARIA, that's what it is. We're trying to create internet applications which are more accessible. So why is it important? Well, the internet is full of beautiful interfaces, some not so beautiful, I guess, as well, and it's full of exciting interactions, and it's just getting more and more advanced. ARIA is used to make these experiences more inclusive by making them work for assistive technologies. So a lot of the crazy things that you see, like slide-in menus and drop-down lists and animations and all that sort of stuff, can be quite nice for people who are sighted, but a lot of that isn't exposed to assistive technologies. If you're using a screen reader or whatever, sometimes you don't even know the content's there. So that's what ARIA is really important for, is making all of them experiences equal. And it's also really important if you work in the public sector, because there's a criterion which is 1.4.2 name role value, and as part of that you need to make sure that every element has an accessible name, it has a role assigned to it, and its value can be surfaced to assistive technologies. And that's one of the things that ARIA can help you to do if you're building complex interfaces. So what does it actually do? Well, it adds additional context for assistive technology users. So dynamic content and advanced user interface controls. So if things are changing on the page that maybe don't have the focus at the time, it can update those things. It can tell you if something's expanded or collapsed or pressed or focused and that sort of thing. It actually works by modifying the accessibility tree, which is the accessibility tree is what assistive technology uses to present content to the user. It doesn't change anything about an element's look, function, or behavior. So if you modify a role or something, which we'll look at in a second, if you modify an element using ARIA, it's important to note it won't change the look of the element and it won't change its behavior. So if you change a button to be a link, it'll still look like a button and it'll still look and feel like a button. If you click it, it'll still have a different state for when it's pressed down and when you've let go and that kind of thing. ARIA is just going to change the way that assistive technologies see that element, not how it's visually presented on the screen. So I briefly mentioned the accessibility tree. Assistive technology, contrary to popular belief, cannot actually see the HTML in your page. It can't see the DOM or the document object model. It can only read the accessibility tree, and the accessibility tree is built automatically by the browser using your HTML code. So you can't edit the accessibility tree directly. You can only affect it by changing the elements, roles, or the attributes that you use in your HTML. And I'll give you a quick example of the accessibility tree. I like to use it in Chrome. Every browser's got one, but I find the one that in Chrome is the nicest to use. So if you go to any website, let's just go to my blog. So you open your Chrome DevTools, you choose the accessibility tab, and then you enable the full page accessibility tree. So in Chrome, mine's already going to be activated, but I'll show you how to do it. If you go to inspect, you get HTML code. Down here on these tabs, you can go along to accessibility. And there's an experimental flag here where you can enable the full page accessibility tree. If you turn that on and restart the browser, you get a little accessibility icon up here in the HTML panel. And when you click that, you get the accessibility tree. So this is what the assistive technology can see. If you hit my blog with a screen reader, it can see this. It can't see all of the HTML. All it can see is this. And in here, we can see that there's a link here, which is called skip domain content. So that's the skip link at the top of the page. It's got a banner, which is a main landmark for the header. It's got an image in there, which has got alt text of Craig Abbott's signature logo. There's a navigation menu, which has a list in it. There's a button, there's a main tag, there's a heading. You kind of get the idea, but this is all being built using the HTML that I've provided. So It does kind of look similar. If you look at the HTML and you look at the accessibility tree, you should see the same thing. So if that's a link and we go into the accessibility tree, we can also see that that's a link. So they kind of match, but it doesn't always match, and we'll look at that in a second. Just kind of before we get into the nitty gritty of it, I guess, there is a word of warning. It is easy to get carried away when you first discover ARIA, but there is a saying that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. In fact, pages with ARIA actually produce around 40% more accessibility errors than those without it. This is mainly down to bad implementation, but it's also because ARIA is used to translate complex interactions. So the more complexity you add, the more likely it is to go wrong. So it's not necessarily that adding ARIA is going to create more accessibility problems. It's normally just that when you're using ARIA, you're trying to do complex interactions, and those by their very nature create more problems. If you've just got a static page with some static content, then it's going to be relatively easy to do just using native elements. So the statistic is a bit of a worrying one, but it is important to note that that's probably down to complexity rather than ARIA itself. And whenever you're using ARIA, it's often used in conjunction with JavaScript, and there are many reasons why JavaScript might not load. So you should always start working with native HTML and then layer the JavaScript on top to modify the default behavior. Don't just kind of have something hidden and then rely on JavaScript to reveal it. You should have it visible first, then hide it using JavaScript. And there's a little bit of an example of that later on. So there are 5 rules to ARIA. They call them rules. They're more like guidelines because they say, rule 1, don't do this unless absolutely necessary, in which case it probably isn't a rule to me. It's more like a guideline. And I have summarized them for the purpose of this talk, but you can go and look at them on the W3C website. They're written a little bit more academically than what I've covered them off with here, but the gist's the same. So the first rule is try not to use ARIA. If you can use native elements to achieve the behavior that you want, then do that. Only make custom elements if you absolutely have to. 2 is try not to change the native semantics. So again, unless you have to, try not to change those native elements, especially if you're using non-interactive elements to create an interactive one. For example, if you're changing a link to a button, maybe that's okay, but you shouldn't be changing a heading to work as a button or something like that, because a heading's a non-interactive element and it'll just change the role, but it'll not port any of the behaviors over. So if you turn it into a button, you'll then be able to see it with assistive technology as a button, but it won't have all of the features of a button like the states and the appearance and that kind of thing. The third rule is all interactive controls must work with a keyboard. So anything that you create, which you can tap on, drag, drop, slide, or scroll, must also work with a keyboard. And all custom controls must be mapped to standard keystrokes. So for example, if you make a custom button using role equals button, then making it work using both the spacebar and the enter key is important, because that's how the native button element works, which is why you should really use the native elements if you can, because otherwise you have to build all of that functionality in manually, which is a lot more effort. Number 4 is don't hide elements which can still be focused. So don't use role equals presentation or ARIA hidden equals true on anything which is still interactive using a keyboard. ARIA hidden is inherited by its children elements. So this also applies to parent elements. Like if you put ARIA hidden at the very top of your page on your HTML tag, then nothing on the page is going to be available to screen readers because it gets inherited. And the last rule is that all elements must have an accessible name. An element may have a visible name, which is a one that's on the page where when you look at it visually, then 2 things are tied together, but it's only considered to have an accessible name when it's available to assistive technology. So just because there's a label visible on the page doesn't necessarily mean that a screen reader can read the label, which means that that element doesn't have an accessible name. So ARIA's mainly got 3 categories. It's actually got 4, but one of them's deprecated, which I'll mention in a second. But we're going to have a little look at roles, states and properties, and live regions. We'll also look at accessible names, which I've just mentioned, because there's a few ways you can kind of pull them together. So roles is the first thing to look at. The role is the main identity of an element. It sets the expectations for the assistive technology on how it should behave. So custom elements should be consistent with native ones so that they're recognizable and familiar. So again, if it looks like a button, it's got to behave like a button. There are implicit ARIA roles on every element. This kind of means you don't have to assign it one. The browser just does it automatically. and most of them are obvious. So if you create a main tag, if you create an element using the main tag, it automatically has a role of main. You don't have to assign that. If you create a button, it automatically has a role of button. If you create an image, it automatically has a role of image, unless you assign it an empty alt attribute, in which case it'll become role presentation. That's why when we say you've got to provide a blank alt attribute for images, that's why, because it actually changes the role under the hood. If you don't supply an alt attribute, screen readers will still see it as an image and have a go reading it out. If you provide it with a blank alt attribute, it'll just ignore it. Obviously, if the image is important, don't leave the alt attribute blank because it will change it to role equals presentation. Some of the implicit roles are a bit weird. Some elements have roles which don't match their tags. These are usually legacy elements which have been around since HTML was first invented. So don't always assume that the pattern is role equals element. For example, if you use a header tag, the role is actually banner. And if you use a footer tag, the role is actually content info. And if you use an anchor tag, the role is actually link. So if you try and change a div to act as your header, if you give it a role of header, that's not going to work. You'll have to give it a role of banner. So that's just something to be aware of. They are all listed on MDN, which I can show you at the end if there's time. But you can look them all up, and every element's got a role, but they don't always match. So just be careful of that. As we mentioned before with the image, if you use role equals presentation, then that removes the element from the accessibility tree, but it still leaves it visible on the page. And it's very similar to ARIA hidden, but there are actually differences. So for example, horizontal rules on the page, you might just want to add some lines onto the page to break the content up, but you might not necessarily want the screen reader to read them out all the time, because every time it gets to a HR, it's going to read out page break. And if you've got them all over the place, that can be quite annoying, and they're probably not relevant to the content. So in that case, you might just want to add role equals presentation to that horizontal rule, and then the screen reader will ignore it. So we said everything's got a default role, and we've kind of talked a little bit about changing the role. Like any element can have its role overridden. So it is really important that the role and the visual style and match. So as we said at the start, if you use the ARIA attribute or the role attribute, it won't change the visual look or feel of that thing. It'll just change what it's called in the accessibility tree. There are some examples where you might want to use a link instead of a button. So call to actions are really common. If you're on a website and it's like buy it now, that's a big button usually. Another example where we see this is on GovUK start pages. So they've got a big green button that says start, but the button's actually a link which takes you to another service. In those cases, it's fine to use a link, but because we've made it look like a button, we have to change the role to be a button. If there's a mismatch, it normally means for people who are using assistive technology like Dragon, where you talk commands at the computer, they're not going to work. So the Dragon user can see a big button on the page and they're saying click button. If it doesn't have a role of button, it's not going to work because the assistive technology is looking in the accessibility tree for a button and all it can see is a link. So if you change the role of anything, make sure that visually it matches what it is that you're doing. You can't just kind of use the roles however you want. There has to be a relationship between how they look and what you are telling the accessibility software to treat them as. Having the correct is really important. The assistive technology does not know what an element looks like. It only knows what role it's assigned. It can't see the elements. It just reads their properties. If there's a mismatch, it just causes issues for people. So I've got an example here of some roles, which I'm going to try and open up now. So the first thing I'm going to do is open them up in Chrome, and I'm going to show you how they're coded up. So I'll just zoom in on this panel a little bit so you can see it. The way that these are marked up is we've got a button. It's a native button element. There's nothing untoward being done to this. It is literally just a button. Then we've got another button, but we've assigned it a role of a link. So technically it's a link now. We've got a normal link. Again, there's nothing being added to this. It is just a standard link. And then we've got a role of button applied to another link. So we've got two links, two buttons, but two of them have been messed with or tampered with. If we go into the accessibility tree, we've got a main tag, we've got a heading, we've got a button as you'd expect, and now we've got a link rather than a button because we've changed the role on it. Then we've got the link, which is native, and then we've got the button because we've changed the role on the link. So if I open this up in Safari and hit it with a screen reader, what you'll find is when we bring up the links menu and we kind of toggle through them, the assistive technology will now treat those things with roles to what we've changed them to. So if I bring the rotor up and look at the links.
Headings menu, form controls menu, landmarks menu, Windows spot menu, links menu. Link, this is a link. Link, this is a link.
We've got two links which say this is a link. That's bad practice. I shouldn't have done that. But the bottom one is the native link, as you can see, and the top one is the one that was originally a button, but we changed its role.
Link, this is a link.
Again, if we go into form controls, we've got this is a button, then we've got this is a link, and then we've got this is a button, which I should have probably looked at the content on it. So sorry about that. But
this is a button. Link, this is a link. This is a button.
So yeah, changing the roles will change the way that the assistive technology sees that stuff. States and properties. So this is the next thing we're going to look at in terms of ARIA. So we've looked at the role, which is the main identifier for the element. The states and properties add additional context. There's three main categories for the states and properties, which are widget attributes, live region attributes, and relationship attributes. This is the fourth category that I was talking about earlier, which is deprecated. There's a category for drag and drop attributes, but in the current version of ARIA, the two attributes you can use for drag and drop are deprecated. This means you can use them at the moment, but they're likely to be removed from future versions of ARIA, which means they'll then be removed from browsers. The attributes for that are ARIA grabbed, which states the element is currently being held by the cursor. So if it's grabbed, the cursor has got a hold of it. And ARIA drop effect is when the cursor has dropped the element over the target element. So if you're dragging something into a window, the drop effect fires when you drop it into the window. It's been dropped in the right place, basically, is when that fires. Like I say, you can use these at the moment. There is a plan to remove it from ARIA in the future, but it probably won't be removed until there's native HTML ways to do that. So it's probably fine for now. Just if you do use it, you're probably going to have to redesign that component at some point in the future. But I guess you could say that with anything that you design. So just something to be aware of. So widget attributes are attributes which help users to understand the current state of something. So for an example, an element can be hidden using ARIA hidden equals true. It can be pressed using ARIA pressed equals true. It can be selected using ARIA selected equals true, expanded using ARIA expanded equals true. And they normally have inverses of that as well. So for example, you can have something which is collapsed, but in order to make it collapse, you need to set ARIA expanded to false. So some of them, by setting it to false, you get a second state. For other things, if you set it to false, then it's just as if you haven't applied the attribute. ARIA hidden, we mentioned briefly when we were talking about role equals presentation, but there are some slight differences. If you use CSS to visually hide any elements using display none or visibility hidden, they are automatically hidden to assistive technologies. So if you set display none on a block of content, it'll automatically be removed from the accessibility tree, and that's the same with visibility hidden. Whereas if you use ARIA hidden on something, it is still visible on the page. It's just hidden to the assistive technology. So ARIA hidden will remove it from the accessibility tree. Display none will remove it from both the page and the tree. And there's a slight difference between the way that ARIA hidden works and the way that role presentation works. They are deceptively similar in that they remove elements from the accessibility tree, but the difference is in the inheritance. So if you use role presentation, it'll only actually remove the element that you place that attribute on. Whereas if you use ARIA hidden, it'll also remove all of its children. So for example, if you have a section and you apply ARIA hidden equals true to that section, then the link that's in that section is also ARIA hidden. Anything which is in there, the screen reader can't see. The whole thing's inherited from the parent block. So I've got a little example of that here. ARIA hidden and role. So again, we've got the same list of links. The top one has been ARIA hidden. The bottom one has been hidden using role equals presentation. If we look at the HTML, they're just nav elements. So we've got nav ARIA hidden equals true, and we've got nav role equals presentation. If we look in the accessibility tree, we've got three links here, but we can see they're set to hidden true, which means that it's going to be ignored by a screen reader. Whereas in the second list, none of them are hidden, which means that the role of presentation is actually only set to the navigation item itself, which is why we can't see it. Let me bring it up in Safari and I'll show you on a screen reader, so hopefully it'll make a bit more sense. So again, if we bring up the links menu, in theory, there should be 6 links on that page, but we should only see 3.
Links menu. Link. Home. Link. About. Link. Contact.
And the reason why we can only see 3 is because that presentation role doesn't pass its ARIA, well, its hidden attribute down onto its children, whereas the one on ARIA hidden does. So the thing that might cause you problems with that is if you use ARIA hidden and it also applies to all of the children in that element, you can still tab to them using a keyboard. So that's just something to be aware of. Obviously for the role presentation one, it's fine because these are still exposed to the assistive technology. But if you use ARIA hidden, it only actually hides it from assistive technology. The keyboard will still focus it and you can still see it on the page. And then we've also got an example of ARIA expanded. This is probably the most complex example that we've got here, so bear with me because it might be a little bit much. This is an example of showing and hiding content. So we've got a button here. We can click on the button. That's going to show some content, and we can hide the content again using the button. In the HTML, it's got an ARIA expanded equals false attribute on the button, and we've got an ARIA controls which tells the browser that this controls something with the ID of content. The content is this div attribute here, this div tag. It's got an ID of content, so them two line up, which tells the browser that the button controls this content here. This has a class of hidden, which removes it from the page, but well, it hides it from the page. An example of progressive enhancement is if we disable JavaScript and refresh the page, the content's there and the button isn't there. So we've got the title, we've got the content, and we've got the paragraphs. There's no button to hide it. It hasn't taken it off the page. But if we turn JavaScript on, then we get the button and we get the hidden content. And the way that that's working is it's actually just, it's loading the page up first. It's creating a button. It's then adding the ARIA attributes to that button. It's kind of building it using JavaScript, and then it's applying what it needs to do when you click it. And I'll share these examples so you can have a dig through them in more detail. But basically, right before the JavaScript code finishes, it then inserts the button and it adds the hidden class to the content. So this means if JavaScript breaks anywhere between the top of the page and this line, the content will still be visible on the page. The very last thing that it does is hide the content. And that's just an example of progressive enhancement where if for whatever reason that JavaScript breaks, the content should still load. And in terms of how it works, we've got ARIA expanded as false. When it expands, we change that to ARIA expanded equals true. And I'll show you that working with the screen reader just so that it gives the additional context.
Show content collapsed button main. Hide content expanded button. You are currently on a main. It show content collapsed button.
With the screen reader, that's telling it there's content, like it's expanded something and it's collapsed something. And that just lets the screen reader know that when you click it, something else has happened. If we didn't have ARIA expanded on, when you click that button, the screen reader wouldn't read anything out at all. Live regions help a user to understand what's happening in a section when it's got dynamic content. There are attributes you can use to let assistive technology know when it should announce changes. So you can have ARIA busy. It'll tell the screen reader that something's still busy loading. You can use ARIA live, which we'll look at in a second, but that informs the user if any text is added to the section. You can use ARIA atomic, which will read all of the content in a section again, not just the bit which is changed. So if you apply ARIA atomic to a parent element, if you change any of the children, it'll read everything out that's inside of that area again. Whereas if you use ARIA live, it'll just announce the bit that's changed. And then there's ARIA relevant, which is supposed to inform a user when content's removed, but it's actually a bit broken. We don't use ARIA relevant. VoiceOver and NVDA ignore it completely, and JAWS will just say removed. It won't tell you what was removed, it just says removed, in which case it's probably more confusing to the user than actually just not having it. Rather than using ARIA relevant to track removed content. So an example of where you might want to tell somebody that something has been removed is if you were in a chat session and somebody left the chat. That's a good example of where you might have wanted to use ARIA relevant. So rather than applying ARIA relevant to the person as they get removed from the DOM, you would add text to the ARIA live region, which explained what happened. So for example, if we put text into that chat saying Craig Abbott has left the chat, that will definitely get announced by the screen reader rather than relying on the screen reader picking up the fact that somebody was removed from, like an element was removed from the DOM. ARIA live regions are necessary when you've got content which is changing on the page, which is away from the user's focus. So the screen reader can only look at one thing at a time. But for example, if you received a notification, then you might not know that it's there. People who are sighted might see it pop up in the corner. They might see a red dot appear on their messages or something. But blind users also need to be informed in a timely manner that something on the page has changed. And that's what we use ARIA Live for. There's a few different options for ARIA Live. You can have off, which is implicit. Every element ARIA Live is off by default. Unless you're doing something dynamically, you don't normally need to set it to off. The two which you'll see used most often are polite and assertive. Polite will tell the screen reader to cue the changes and then read them out at the end. So it won't interrupt it. If it's busy reading a paragraph of text, it'll finish reading that paragraph of text and then it will announce the changes at the end. If you use assertive, the screen reader will just stop whatever it's doing immediately and announce the changes that were made. We try to avoid using assertive wherever possible because it's like if you're having a conversation and somebody suddenly just puts their face in front and just interrupts, like it's going to be really jarring and quite annoying. You might never get to the end of what it is that you're trying to read. It also adds increased cognitive load for the user. If it's constantly interrupting, you're constantly having to go back and remember where you're up to get the information out the page. We only use assertive in emergency situations or where there's something that is required for the user to do immediately. So for example, if the user is about to be logged out and lose any unsaved work, that might be a fair use of assertive. If it waits until you finish reading a paragraph to tell you that you're about to be logged out and you're going to lose your unsaved work, it might have happened by the time the screen reader reads it out. So that would be an example where you'd want to just interrupt and be like, you need to save your work now, or you need to do something. There is a role of alert. So I know we looked at roles earlier, but there's a special role which is called alert. And if you use that on any element, it automatically gets assigned ARIA live assertive, and it'll also assign ARIA atomic true. So if you put anything on the page at any time, if you suddenly just add a block of text to the page using JavaScript and you give it a role of alert, that'll automatically override anything else that the screen reader is doing. So we use this on things like validation errors. They have a role of alert. Again, it's one of those things where use it sparingly. If it's a notification which isn't massively important, if your work, again, we use the example of saving your work. If you're using something like Google Docs and it saves every couple of minutes, you don't want to interrupt the user to tell it that it's saved the work in the background. You might just want to tell them when it's finished doing whatever. So if you add a role of alert to say your changes have been saved or it's been automatically saved, it's just going to keep interrupting you all of the time, which isn't really useful. So for things which aren't like massively important, avoid using the role of alert on them as well. Use an ARIA live polite region and just kind of make it a bit more sort of friendly, a little bit more patient, I guess. So I've got an example of ARIA live in a nutshell. I've got a quote at the top of the page. The screen reader is going to start reading the quote, and then this square block of text here is in an ARIA live region, and you might have just seen that it changed. So there's about a 10-second delay, and then the text in this area is going to change. And hopefully, with any luck, you'll see that the screen reader queues up them changes and then announces them at the end of whatever it's doing, even though that bit hasn't got focus.
Heading Level 1. I wish for a world that views disability, mental or physical, not as a hindrance but as unique attributes that can be seen as powerful assets if given the right opportunities. The screen reader is now reading out the text in the ARIA Live region as it noticed it changed.
Hopefully that made sense, but as it was reading out the paragraph of text, the text in the ARIA Live region changed. So the screen reader added the text from there to the end of whatever it was saying and announced it at the end. So even though this section wasn't focused with the screen reader or with the keyboard, the user was still announced that that bit had changed. That's kind of how ARIA Live works. Then we've got relationship attributes. These help assistive technology understand how elements work together. So in the example we saw before around expanding and collapsing content, we had ARIA controls. This attaches an interface control to another element. So it gives the browser a clue that when you use this button, something else over here is going to change and these two are related. We can use ARIA labeled by, which allows you to use something else on the page as an accessible name. So normally if you're doing an input, you can use a label, but you might want to use something else as the label rather than duplicating the content. It might work if you've got if you're using a pattern like gov.uk style things where you have one thing per page, you might have a heading on the page. And then rather than using that heading as the input label, you might just say, rather than having a heading and a label which are identical, we'll just not have a label and then we'll tell the input to use the heading as the label. That's what ARIA labeled by does. Again, I'll show you an example in a second. We've also got ARIA described by, and this allows you to add additional context to elements by using another element on the page. So ARIA described by doesn't replace the label, it just gives it more content, and the screen reader will read it out as part of it. Accessible names are important under name role value, which is a WCAG criterion 4.1.2. Every element needs to have an accessible name, and this is what the assistive technology reads from the tree. It's not what you can visibly see on the page. The easiest way to give something an accessible name is just to use a native element. So for example, if you just have a button and you put the word continue in the button, then it's going to use the word continue as the accessible name. You don't have to give it one, it's just implicit because it's within the block. The same with a label for an input. If you assign a label to an input, then that input automatically has an accessible name of whatever that label is. So in this example, we've wrapped the input in a label for postcode, which means when we hit it with a screen reader, it's going to read out postcode. You can use ARIA label, which is an attribute that you can assign to a label where it's going to just read out whatever the string is that you put in them quotes. The problem with this method is it doesn't visually show on a page, so you've got to be careful of how you use it. Sometimes if you use an ARIA label and it's not obvious what that input's for, then you can fail other parts of the web content accessibility guidelines because labels need to be clear and it needs to be obvious what you're putting in that label. So here it will be obvious to a screen reader user, but it wouldn't be obvious to a sighted user. So you've got to be careful on how you use ARIA label and kind of only use it sparingly because it can cause other issues. An example of where you might want to use ARIA label in a good way is to add additional context for screen reader users. So for example, you might have a search field and the label for that field is search, which is fine. That's what you can see on the page. There's a very short label which just says search. But then with a screen reader, you might not know what you can search because you can't quickly see the rest of the page. If the rest of the page was something like the BBC website, you'd know that you had a bunch of different articles in there which you could search. You might have different authors in there which you could search. So you might want to use an ARIA label to change the default label that's on the screen just to add a bit more context. So in this case, the ARIA label says search for people, posts, or pages. So in that case, the search is still there, it still matches, but you're just adding a little bit more context. So ARIA labeled by works the same way as that example we've just looked at, which is ARIA label, except it uses the ID from another element to create the label rather than passing it in directly as a string. So in this example, we have a paragraph. In that paragraph, we've got a span, which has an ID of label, and that says account number. We can then pass that span ID into ARIA labeled by, and then that input, although it hasn't got a label, it will go back up to that span and it'll use that as the accessible name. So in this example, for a sighted user, it just says you will need to provide your account number and there's a field there and that's obvious. But for somebody who's using assistive technology, if they just go into that input, it will actually say account number on it because we've tied them two things together. And using ARIA described by will append additional context to the label rather than acting as the label itself. So in this case, we've got a native input, which we had in the first example, which just says, what is your account number? And then we've got a paragraph underneath it, which is a hint, which says it must be between 6 and 8 digits long. Then what we've done is we've tied the label to the input using the for and ID attributes, which is just the way you do it natively. But then we've added ARIA described by and passed in the ID of the hint. This means now when the screen reader hits it, it will read out what is your account number because that's the label. And then it'll pause and then it'll say must be between 6 and 8 digits long because it's using the hint attached to that label to give it additional context. So there's a little demo again of ARIA labels. this is the demo. I'll try and talk you through it, and then I'll show you it with the screen reader. So we've got a default label and an input. So this is just how it works natively in HTML. There's no ARIA attached to the first example. Then we've got the input, which just has an ARIA label. There is no native label. There's nothing visible on the screen. It's just using that ARIA label attribute and passing the string in. Then we've got an example of a paragraph, and then we're assigning that paragraph to be the label using ARIA labeled by and passing in that attribute. And then the last example is we've got a label, which is native to the input, but then we've also got a paragraph, which is acting as that hint text. And then we're using ARIA described by and passing the hint in. So the one at the bottom has both a label and an ARIA described by paragraph. And if I bring that up in Safari again, I'm always using Safari because VoiceOver doesn't work very well in Chrome, in case you're wondering why. So the first one, which is a native label.
This is a native label. Edit text, main.
That makes sense. The next one is the ARIA label.
This is labeled using ARIA label. Edit text, main.
The next one is the one where we've used the paragraph and then used ARIA labeled by.
This is a paragraph assigned to the input below using ARIA labeled by. Edit text.
And the last one is the one where it's using the native label and ARIA described by to add additional context.
This is another native label. Edit text. This is a paragraph which adds additional context using ARIA described by. You are currently on a text field.
Hopefully that makes sense, but you can see ARIA described by is really useful for adding additional context. But again, use it sparingly. In all honesty, this paragraph, for the sake of a demo, is probably a bit long. Saying something like it should be 6 to 8 characters is acceptable. You don't want to have paragraphs and paragraphs of text being used for ARIA labels or ARIA described by, because it'll just become really verbose for the screen reader user, and they've probably forgot the start by the time they get to the end. And that is everything.
Thanks, Craig. That was fantastic. I'm going to definitely need to watch that again so that I don't forget any of it. Is it okay to wrap an image or a figure in an anchor tag? We see a lot of evidence from users on mobile who assume an image is interactive and tap it multiple times expecting it to do something.
It is, but the image needs to have an accessible name. So you can wrap an image in an anchor tag, like an icon or something of that description, but it needs to have, if you just put an image in and there's no alt text, then the screen reader is either going to ignore it or have a punt at guessing what the button should be. Say you've just got one image and it's, I don't know, a logo. If you just wrap the image in the anchor and then you give the image an alt text of something like home, which at the top of a website, you can normally click the image to go back to the home page, then that will be acceptable, because when the screen reader looks at the link, it's going to say home because it'll use the alt text off the image. It gets a little bit more complicated when you start adding images and text and stuff into interlinks, but it can be done. One of the things that you probably want to avoid, though, are what a lot of people do is they'll wrap an entire section, like a card pattern almost. It's got like a big image and it's got some text, and they'll wrap the whole thing in an anchor tag. The problem with that is that the screen reader, if you just go into the links menu and you just want to look at the links, it's going to treat all of the text content inside of that anchor tag as the accessible name, in which case it's, it could be a whole paragraph. You want to avoid those kind of things. So if you've got a big image and that's kind of to represent a section of the website, if there's text kind of relating to that, normally you would just add like a read more link, or a section to take a link to take you to that, because the link should be concise. If the image alt text can be concise and it's obvious what it does, then it's fine to use that on the link itself, as long as it does have alt text. With SVGs, it can be a little bit more difficult. You've got to kind of give them like an ARIA label, or you've got to assign them a role of image and then use alt text and whatnot. So SVGs are a bit more tricky, but it is, I guess, in a nutshell, it is fine to use those things as long as the accessible name is available to screen reader users.
Why were there 3 buttons in the form controls?
It could be because of the way that I've named them, in all honesty. So yeah, there should be 2 links and 2 buttons. My assumption with the way that I'd built this, and my assumption might be wrong because ARIA's a bit crazy, is that it should have 2 buttons, 2 links.
Form control. This is a button. This is a button. Links menu. Link. Visited link.
So in Chrome, it's fine, but it might be a Safari issue.
You are links menu. Link. This is a link. Link. This is a link. Headings menu. Form controls. This is a button. Link. This is a link. This is a button. Button.
So that's interesting because we might have just found a bug in Safari. Yeah, so in Chrome it worked fine, which it worked as I expected it to work. It looks like this second button is still being treated as a form control in Safari, but it just shows the precarious nature, I guess, of using things like ARIA to change the attributes of things. Even when you expect them to work, browsers implement them in different ways, and if there's a bug in the accessibility tree, it can break things for users. So that falls back to that first rule of if you can get away without using ARIA, then don't use ARIA.
In this example from the Gov UK Design System Service, there's a link there in the chat, it uses ARIA hidden equals true to hide the SVG that forms the button from the accessibility tree. If I understand what you've said correctly, one could instead use role equals presentation to hide it from the accessibility tree. Which is the preferred method given that it has no children?
This is where things can get a little bit awkward. So not every attribute is, so under HTML5, not every attribute is applicable to every tag. We'll have a look at it, but off the top of my head, I think the problem is that if you put role equals presentation on an SVG, you'll fail HTML validation because it's not a valid attribute on SVG in HTML5 in the current version, whereas ARIA hidden does work. I think they both work if you put role equals presentation on an SVG, although it's not technically valid HTML, I think it does still work, but it means your automatic validation errors and things will flag it up. It'll say role equals presentation is not available on SVGs at this time or something. Role equals presentation is not supported on SVG element. It looks like that is true. I think that's the answer to the question. I think role equals presentation at the moment is not a valid attribute on SVGs, which will cause HTML validation. So in most cases, role equals presentation will work interchangeably with ARIA hidden if it's just on a single attribute. But I think SVGs is one of the weird anomalies.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for making time in your day to attend this session. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Thank you very much to Craig for preparing and delivering this session.